from the creator of An American Tail. Meet the Furlings. They're fun, they're funny, and they're full of mischief.
Furlings!
But their friend Michelle needs a magic potion.
You only have 2 days' time.
Think we should take this?
Now they're on their own and off on an incredible journey. Join Abigail, the leader.
We can take care of ourselves, thank you.
Edgar, the brave.
I'm drowning! Get up. Oh.
And Russell, the one with an enormous appetite for adventure.
Stuck in your stomach!
From the courageous to the outrageous.
They came along!
Ow!
And they...
Come along as they leap into action.
Hallelujah!
Swim against the odds. And together, come up with the perfect plan to reach for the sky.
You don't really mean fly. Michelle's counting on us.
Well, flap their little paws and fly like birdies.
We'll show you. Crank the winder-uppers!
20th Century Fox presents a high-flying adventure that will send your spirits soaring. Once Upon a Forest, featuring the voices of Michael Crawford, Broadway's legendary Phantom,
Stupendous!
and the fabulous Ben Vereen.
There's gonna be some celebrating today.
Once Upon a Forest.
Just beyond your dreams, there is a secret world where every sound is a song, every tree a home, and humans exist only in fairy tales until now. This is a tale of a magical place.
You shrank me?
Yeah.
Catches on quick, doesn't it?
Are you really a human?
I'm Zach.
I'm Krista.
Where high-flying creatures
I'm blind! No! I can see! It's a miracle!
will reach deep into your heart. But now, this most enchanted place is about to face its greatest threat. Join their struggle for survival
Stop! Daddy, let's go!
in this celebration of life. 20th Century Fox invites you to witness the wonder.
This is so incredible.
Spread the word
How can you live without trees?
and plant the seed to save a place called Fern Gully, the last rainforest.
Mr. Topsy Turvy was a funny sort of fellow. Everything about him was either upside down or inside out, back to front, topsy-turvy, in fact. It was all very extraordinary. To give you some idea of how topsy-turvy Mr. Topsy-Turvy was, you ought to see his house. The front door is upside down to start with, and the curtains hang upside down at the windows. And just look at that chimney pot. All very extraordinary. Inside is the same. Just look at that clock standing on Mr. Topsy Turvy's mantelpiece. Isn't that the topsy-turviest clock you've ever seen? And just look at the way Mr. Topsy Turvy reads a book. Not only does he read it upside down, but he starts to read it at the back page. And just look where Mr. Topsy Turvy puts the stamp when he sends a letter to somebody. You ever seen anything like it? Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Topsy Turvy came to the town where you and I live. Nobody's quite sure how Mr. Topsy Turvy got there or where he came from. But he did arrive because somebody saw him getting off the train. The trouble was, he did it in a topsy-turvy way. Which really isn't all that surprising, is it? Mr. Topsy Turvy went to a hotel to find a room to spend the night. The hotel manager tried not to smile when he saw Mr. Topsy Turvy walk into his hotel carrying his suitcase upside down and with his Topsy Turvy hat on his head. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Can I help you?" Now, something you didn't know about Mr. Topsy Turvy is the way he speaks. You see, he sometimes gets things the wrong way round. "Afternoon, good," said Mr. Topsy Turvy to the hotel manager. I'd room alike." The manager scratched his head. "You mean you'd like a room?" he asked. "Please, yes," replied Mr. Topsy Turvy. Eventually, the hotel manager managed to work out what Mr. Topsy Turvy was talking about, and he was taken up in the lift to a bedroom. Then Mr. Topsy Turvy unpacked a suitcase, put on his pajamas, and went to bed. He was rather tired after travelling from wherever he'd come from. The following day, Mr. Topsy Turvy went round the town. But what a fuss his going round the town caused. He took a taxi from the hotel, but so confused the taxi driver trying to tell him where he wanted to go, the poor man drove straight into a traffic light. "Oh, dear," said Mr. Topsy Turvy. "I am sorry, very." Then he went into a big department store in the middle of the town. Walked up to one of the counters. "I'd like a sock of pears," he said to the lady behind the counter. "You mean a pair of socks?" she smiled, and showed him a pair of bright red socks. Mr. Topsy Turvy put them on his hands. Then he tried to leave. But being Mr. Topsy Turvy, he tried to walk down the up escalator, and all the people who were going up the up escalator all fell over themselves. Oh, it was a terrible topsy-turvy jumble. That day, Mr. Topsy Turvy did all sorts of topsy-turvy things. Then he went to an art gallery and insisted on hanging all the pictures upside down so that he could look at them properly. And then, after Mr. Topsy Turvy had been in the town for just one day, he disappeared. Nobody knew how he went or where he went, but he certainly went because he wasn't there anymore. The whole town breathed a sigh of relief. But what the town discovered, even though Mr. Topsy Turvy had left, was that everything was still topsy-turvy. "Read all it about," shouted the newspaper sellers. Instead of shouting, Read all about it. News is the here, said the television newsreader, instead of saying, here is the news. Morning good, people started saying to each other when they met him. Do you how, instead of how do you do? Everybody was talking topsy-turvy. Now, can you think of something to say that's topsy-turvy? Try on, go. I mean, go on, try. Poor Mr. Muddle just couldn't get anything right. Everything he did, everything he tried, everything he said was muddled. Totally, utterly, completely and absolutely muddled. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as hammering a nail into a wall. Now, what could get muddled with hammering a nail into a wall? Mr. Muddle could get it muddled, and frequently did. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as putting on your coat. Now, what could get muddled with putting on your coat? Well, see for yourself. Only Mr. Muddle would put his coat on like that. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as going for a walk. Now, what could get muddled about going for a walk? Well, when your legs start walking one way and you start walking the other, that's a very muddly sort of walk. Poor Mr. Muddle, walking one way and going another. Now, you'd probably like to know where Mr. Muddle lives. In a house by the sea near a place called Seatown. Mr. Muddle's house was supposed to be in the country, but Mr. Muddle, who built the house himself, had got the place muddled up, of course. This story starts one afternoon when Mr. Muddle was having his breakfast. Yeah, we know. We know you don't have breakfast in the afternoon. But you do if you get your meal times muddled up. Mr. Muddle was having bread and butter and jam and a cup of tea with milk and sugar. He spread the butter on the table, then spread the jam on the plate, then poured the milk on the bread, and then filled the cup with sugar, and then poured the tea on the bread. What a terribly muddly mixed-up breakfast. That afternoon, after breakfast, he went for a walk down the beach near his house in order to work up an appetite for supper. Met an old fisherman called George, whom he knew quite well. Afternoon, Mr. Muddle, said George. Good evening, replied Mr. Muddle. George smiled. How'd you like come fishing with me? He asked. Oh, no, please, replied Mr. Muddle eagerly. Help me push the boat out from the beach, called George. Right-o, said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat further up onto the beach. Oh, Mr. Muddle, said George, and had to show Mr. Muddle the difference between pulling and pushing. However, eventually, somehow or other, they managed to get the boat out to sea. Now, let's fish, said George, dropping a fishing line over the side of the boat. Right-o, said Mr. Muddle, and dropped himself over the side of the boat. Oh, Mr. Muddle, said George again. It wasn't any good. They didn't catch any fish, so they decided to go home before it became dark. Help me pull the boat up onto the beach, called George. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and pushed the boat back into the water. George was just about to say, "Oh, Mr. Muddle," again, when he had an idea. He smiled to himself. "Help me push the boat out into the sea," George called. "Right-ho," said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat up onto the beach. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," said George. Mr. Muddle smiled a smile and went home. George smiled a smile and went to tell everybody. The following day in Seatown, Mr. Brick, the builder, asked Mr. Muddle to hold his coat for him. "Right-ho," said Mr. Muddle, and held his ladder for him, which is what Mr. Brick really wanted. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mr. Brick, who'd been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was very pleased. Then Mrs. Scrub at the laundry asked Mr. Muddle to pass her the soap. "Right-ho," said Mr. Muddle, and passed her a clothes peg, which is what Mrs. Scrub really wanted. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mrs. Scrub, who'd also been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was extremely pleased. And then Mr. Black, the coalman, asked Mr. Muddle to lift a sack of coal down from his lorry. "Right-ho," said Mr. Muddle, and lifted a sack of coal up onto the lorry, which is what Mr. Black really had wanted all along. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mr. Black. George had talked to everybody. Mr. Muddle was delighted. In fact, Mr. Muddle was so delighted that he decided to go home and cook himself a large meal to celebrate. Roast turkey, peas, potatoes, and gravy. He put the turkey in the cupboard to cook. He peeled the peas. He put the potatoes in the refrigerator to boil. And then, do you know what he did? He tried to slice the gravy. Oh, Mr. Muddle. Mr. Mean lived up to his name. He lived in what could have been a nice house, but wasn't. He never painted it, or mended the windows, or repaired the roof. Inside it was the same. No carpets, no curtains, no pictures, no fires. And Mr. Mean was so mean he made his furniture out of old orange boxes and then complained about the price of nails. Why, he was so mean. Do you know what he gave his brother for Christmas last year? A piece of coal. It wasn't as if Mr. Mean didn't have any money. Oh, no. He had lots of money. But would he spend it? Not old Meanie. Not if he could help it. One day he was sitting in his gloomy kitchen having a gloomy meal when there was a knock at the door. "Drat," he said, because he didn't like people. "Drat and bother." He opened the door, and there on his doorstep stood a wizard. A rather fat wizard.
"Hello," said the wizard. "I wonder if, by any chance, as it's such a warm day, you could possibly, if it's not too much trouble, be so kind as to, if it's not inconvenient, perhaps, as I'm very thirsty, provide me with, do you think, a glass, if it's not too much to ask, of water, please?"
He was a very wordy wizard. "No," replied Mr. Mean rudely, and shut the door in his face. "How did you get in?"
"Well,"
replied the wizard,
"it was by, how shall I put it, I just, well, you know, waved the old what's-his-name magic wand, don't you know, and then, you know, well, here I am, if you know what I mean." "You must be very poor,"
he remarked kindly, looking round. "Oh, yes, I am," lied Mr. Mean.
"Then perhaps I can help you,"
said the wizard, pulling up a box to sit down on. The box didn't move, so the wizard pulled it harder, and this time it did move. In fact, it tipped up and spilled Mr. Mean's money all over the floor.
well, 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 well. Well, 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 oh, well, 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 well. It would appear to me that you, sir, are an old meanie. Mr. Meany didn't hear him. He was too busy scrabbling all over the floor trying to pick up his money. And meanies need to be taught a lesson. And so saying, he waved his magic wand. All the money turned into potatoes. Potatoes. Oh, dear. Oh dear me. Oh, dear me. Please turn my money back into money. Oh, please, please, please. Perhaps, replied the wizard. But on the other hand, taking all things into account, by and large, things being what they are on the face of it, perhaps not. However, continued the wordy wizard, if you make me a solemn promise never to be mean again, then I'll turn the potatoes back into money. But, he added sternly, if you are ever mean again, then it's, how shall I put it, then it's potatoes for you, my lad, if not other vegetables as well. The following day, Mr. Mean decided to walk to town. He never took the bus, because that cost money. On the way, he met an old washerwoman carrying an enormous bundle of washing. Oh, please, please, kind sir, she said. Could you possibly help me to carry this washing? It's so heavy. No, replied Mr. Mean. It's your washing. You carry it. But as soon as he'd said that, he felt a tingling in his nose. Mr. Mean's nose turned into a carrot. Oh, no, he gasped. The old washerwoman chuckled. And then Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. Yes, oh yes, he cried in a panic. Of course I'll help you, of course. And the carrot turned back into a nose, and off he went. The old washerwoman chuckled again, and turned back into the wizard. It had been him all along, you see. Then Mr. Mean passed by a cottage garden. In the garden there was an old man chopping wood. Excuse me, he called. Could you give an old man a bit of a hand, young fellow, my lad? No, replied Mr. Mean. It's your wood. You chop it. But as soon as the words had passed his lips, guess what happened? His ears turned into tomatoes. Oh, no, he gasped. The old man chuckled. Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. Oh, yes, yes, he cried. Well, no, yes, of course I'll give you a hand, of course. Mm-hmm. And he chopped and chopped until all the wood was cut. And the tomatoes turned back into ears, and off he went. Eventually, Mr. Mean arrived in the town. There was a little boy crying because his ball had got stuck on the top of the wall. Oh, please, sir, could you reach my ball down for me? No, retorted Mr. Mean. Your ball, you... Then he stopped. There was a funny tingling feeling in his feet. Yes, he said hurriedly. Yes, of course I will, of course. Mm. And he reached up and passed the ball to the boy and went on his way, looking anxiously at his feet. The little boy stopped crying and turned into the wizard. I think, he said to himself, I think that Mr. Mean, by and large, is beginning, if I'm not very much mistaken, to be not quite so mean. And I think, although I could be wrong, although I never am, that he has, thank goodness, learned his lesson. And you know something? Mr. Mean had learned his lesson. Today, he's nothing like so mean as he used to be. And he doesn't keep his money in a box in the kitchen anymore. Today, his house is mended and painted and spick and span. And he's turned into quite a generous sort of fellow. Goodness, he's so generous. Do you know what he gave his brother last Christmas? 2 pieces of coal. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice.
And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. Sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so, too, did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
Boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. He walked into the butcher's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat,
Boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Definitely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb. And she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you've got the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
Boomed. I'm sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear.
I'd like a loaf of bread.
Mr. Noisy shouted. Oh, I'm sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Could you speak up a bit, please?
I'd like a loaf of bread,
Roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat.
Boom. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice.
I'd like a piece of meat.
Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon.
I said I'd like a piece of meat.
Roared Mr. Noisy. Beg your pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed. Hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread.
Boom. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice.
A loaf of...
Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat.
He boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon.
Yes, I did.
Shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice.
I said I'd like a...
Then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said,
quietly. I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So, carrying his bread and meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. And then he stopped. Then he thought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something that Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. And you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb, Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. Mr. Nosy liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosy was the sort of person who, if he came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr. Nosy was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. Mr. Nosy was the sort of person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosy was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosy would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosy peeking and prying? It did not. Mr. Nosy lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tittletown. The people of Tittletown decided that Mr. Nosy was becoming much too nosy. And so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him. We must find some way of stopping his being so nosy, said old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. That's right, said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tittletown laundry. He needs to be taught a lesson. If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything, said Mr. Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. Listen, he said, grinning. I have a plan. All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. The following morning, Mr. Nosy was out walking along Tittletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself. And tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peeped in. Splash went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosy's nose, covering it with bright red paint. Oh, dear. I am so sorry, said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosy had to go straight home and try to remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following day, Mr. Nosy was walking past the laundry when he heard someone laughing on the other side of the wall. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself. And, standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. Snap! Went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosy's nose. Oh, dear. Oh, I am sorry, said Mrs. Washer,
who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself. Creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, he peeped round. Bang! Went a hammer right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh dear. Oh, I am sorry, said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor red sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard someone sawing wood. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and crept up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Hurd, the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Hurd hurried off into Tittletown to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that, Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tittletown. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you were ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you'd better expect one thing, a very sore nose. Mr. Lazy lives in Sleepyland, which is a very lazy-looking and sleepy-like place. The birds in Sleepyland fly so slowly they sometimes fall out of the sky. The grass takes so long to grow, it only needs cutting once a year. Even the trees are lazy-looking and sleepy-like. And do you know what time everybody gets up in Sleepyland? The answer is they don't get up in the morning. They get up in the afternoon. And incidentally, this is what a Sleepyland clock looks like. Everything takes so long to do, there's only time for 4 hours a day. Anyway, this story starts with Mr. Lazy being fast asleep in bed. In Sleepyland, they call that being slow asleep. He spends rather a lot of time in bed. It's his favourite place to be. He opened his eyes, yawned again, went back to sleep. Later, Mr. Lazy opened his eyes again, yawned again, went back to sleep again. Much later, Mr. Lazy got up and went to make his breakfast.
We say breakfast, although really it was tea time. He put the kettle on to make some tea. Kettles take 2 hours to boil in Sleepy Len. Then he toasted a slice of bread. Bread takes 3 hours to go brown in Sleepy Len. Toast never gets burnt there. While he was waiting for his kettle to boil and his bread to toast, Mr. Lazy went into the garden of Yawn Cottage, which is where he lived. Sat down on a chair, and you can probably guess what happened next. That's right. He yawned. He yawned again. I went to sleep. Suddenly, he woke with a jump, which is something that doesn't happen very often to Mr. Lazy. And the reason he woke with a jump was because of the noise. Wake up! Was the noise. Wake up, wake up, wake up! There were 2 men standing in front of him. I'm Mr. Busy, said one of the men. And I'm Mr. Bustle, said the other. Come along now, said Mr. Bustle busily. We can't have you sleeping all day, added Mr. Busy, bustling Mr. Lazy to his feet. Who are you? Who are you? We're Bustle and Busy. Oh. Come along now. Haven't got all day. But, no time for buts, said Mr. Busy. Or ifs, added Mr. Bustle. There's the wood to chop and the beds to make and the floors to clean and the coal to get and the windows to polish and the plates to wash and the furniture to dust and the grass to cut and the hedges to clip and the food to cook. And the clothes to mend, added Mr. Busy. Oh, dear, groaned Mr. Lazy in a daze. The wood to clean and the beds to get and the floors to cut and the coal to cook and the windows to make and the plates to mend and the furniture to chop and the grass to wash and the hedges to dust and the clothes to clip. He'd got it all completely wrong. He was in such a daze. Then Bustle and Busy set Mr. Lazy to work. Chopping and making and cleaning and getting and polishing and washing and dusting and cutting and clipping and cooking and mending. Not to mention all the fetching and carrying. Poor Mr. Lazy. Now, they said, when he'd finished, it's time for a walk. And off they set on the longest walk Mr. Lazy had ever been on. Mr. Lazy is one of those people who never walks when he has a chance of sitting down and never sits down when he has a chance of lying down. But this day, he had no choice. They made him walk for miles and miles and miles until he felt that his legs must be worn right down to his body. Poor Mr. Lazy. When they arrived back at Yawn Cottage, Mr. Busy said, right, now for a run. Oh, no. When I blow this whistle, said Mr. Bustle, losing whistle, we've got to start running, as fast as you can, added Busy. Mr. Lazy groaned a deep groan and closed his eyes. Mr. Bustle put the whistle to his lips. Went the whistle. Mr. Lazy, poor Mr. Lazy, started to run, but his legs weren't getting him anywhere. He opened his eyes and looked down to see why, and the reason his legs weren't getting him anywhere was because he was sitting on a chair in the garden. And there was no sign of Mr. Busy or Mr. Bustle. It had all been a terrible dream. And the whistle was the whistling kettle boiling in the kitchen. Mr. Lazy heaved a sigh of relief. And then he went into the kitchen and sat down to have his breakfast and to think about his dream. But you know what happened next, don't you? Wake up, Mr. Lazy. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Mr. Chatterbox was one of those people who simply couldn't stop talking.
He used to talk to anybody and everybody about anything and everything, going on and on and on. On and on and on. And on and on and on. And when he didn't have anybody else to talk to, he used to talk to himself. Morning, Mr. Chatterbox, he used to say to himself. Morning to you, he used to reply to himself. Nice day, isn't it? Yes, it is for the time of the year. And so on, and so on, and on, and on.
The other day, Monday, I think it was, or perhaps it was Tuesday. Very well, because it's quite good morning, don't you agree? Of course you do. But that's what you said to me in the first place, isn't it? Yes, I really must. This hat is really, certainly, the best hat that I've ever seen in my life. And in my life, I must say I've seen some hats. And furthermore, it's not quite so good a morning, in my opinion, but I might be wrong, although I don't feel.
He lived in a box-shaped house in a village. Chatterbox Cottage. One morning, the postman arrived with a letter for him. Morning, Mr. Chatterbox, said the postman. Oh, good morning to you, postman, replied Mr. Chatterbox. Although, as I was saying to myself only yesterday, or was it the day before, I forget. However, it's not quite so good a morning, in my opinion, but I might be wrong, although I'm not very often, as it was the other day. Monday, I think it was. Or perhaps it was Tuesday. But never mind. Because it is quite a good morning, don't you agree? Well, yes, of course you do, because that's what you said to me in the first place. And he went on and on and on all the morning. And the poor postman was late delivering all his letters. That afternoon, Mr. Chatterbox went into the hat shop in the village. Hello, Mr. Bowler, he said to the man who owned the hat shop. Do you think if it's possible that I could buy, if it's not too expensive, but I'm sure it won't be, a new hat? Because, would you believe it? Well, yes, of course you would. But anyway, as I was saying, my present hat, the one on my head, as you can see, is getting, how can I put it, a little too old. Because I've had it for, let me see now, must be, let's see, 10 years? No, I tell a lie, it can't be that long. Or can it? Well, yes, it could be. On the other hand, and he went on and on all the afternoon, half the night. Long after poor Mr. Bowler should have shut up shop and gone home. Eventually, when Mr. Bowler managed to get a word in edgeways, or was it sideways, he promised to order a new hat for Mr. Chatterbox. Then he pushed Mr. Chatterbox out of his shop, still talking, of course, and went home for his supper, which was cold, of course, because Mrs. Bowler cooked it for him hours ago. And while he ate, he thought. Exactly 1 week later, the new hat for Mr. Chatterbox arrived. The postman delivered it to Mr. Bowler's shop. At last, said Mr. Bowler, heaving a sigh of relief. I think this hat is going to be the answer to the problem of Mr. Chatterbox talking so much. Oh, I wish it could be, said the postman. How can it? Because, replied Mr. Bowler, this hat is a magic hat. Oh, replied the postman, who didn't quite understand. That same afternoon, Mr. Bowler took the new hat round to Chatterbox Cottage. Oh, goody, said Mr. Chatterbox, seizing the hat box and opening it. It's my new hat, my lovely new hat. Oh, I couldn't wait for it to arrive. In fact, I got up early this morning because, aren't I silly? I just knew, I don't know how, but I really knew, that today would be the day. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. And it is. And here is my hat. And oh, isn't it beautiful? I can't wait to try it on. Oh, I do hope it suits me. Do you think it will? Well, of course you do. But why don't you try it on? Said Mr. Bowler, grinning. Try it on? Oh, but yes, of course I must try it on. How silly I've been standing here chattering when I haven't even tried it on yet. Yes, I will. Absolutely, definitely. Try it on straight away. But anyway, because, as I said, it's silly just to talk about trying it on, isn't it? And then not to try it on, isn't it? And so he took the hat out of the box and put it on. It was a beautiful hat. I say, he said, I must say, yes, I really must, that this hat is, because it really is, to say the least, one of the best hats I've ever seen in my life. And in my life, I must say, I've seen some hats. Trilbys, bowlers, deerstalkers, velours, fedoras, Homburgs, operas, toppers, straw cages. But while he was talking, a funny thing was happening. The more words that came out of Mr. Chatterbox's mouth, the larger his hat became. The more Mr. Chatterbox talked, the more the hat grew and grew. Mr. Chatterbox kept on talking and the hat kept on growing. I can't see anything, he said. One minute I was standing here looking at my new hat in the mirror, and now all of a sudden, without my warning, taking me all unawares, just like that, the hat grew down to his feet. And Mr. Chatterbox stopped talking. And as soon as he stopped talking, the hat grew smaller and smaller until it was the same size as when he'd first tried it on. Mr. Bowler was delighted. My special magic hat really works, he chuckled. The following day, Mr. Chatterbox was out for a walk when he met the postman in the village. "Hello, postman," he said. "I said, you like my new hat? Have you ever seen such a fine hat? I'm sure you never have. What a hat." But you know what was happening, don't you? The hat grew and grew and grew the more Mr. Chatterbox talked. "Oh, now I know what Mr. Bowler meant by a magic hat," chuckled the postman, and he went on his way, leaving poor Mr. Chatterbox speechless. He thought, thinking, not talking, thinking. And you know something? That hat taught Mr. Chatterbox his lesson. And these days I don't talk half as much as I used to do, or even a quarter as much, or even a half of or a quarter as much. But in short, I talk less. And you know the reason for that, don't you? Yes, of course you do. But keep it under your hat.